So one thing you find in a lot of places is that trust becomes kind of a quid pro quo arrangement. Like, well, I'll trust you, but only if you trust me first. And this happens a lot, especially in business. When you're starting to talk about money and livelihood and what people's dreams and passions, it's very, very easy for trust to become this finite resource that people clutch very tightly. But what you find in places like the Valley is people give it first. It's very interesting. When you can approach almost anyone, including a lot of famous people in the Valley, and just say, I need some help. And they'll just give it to you because they trust you first, and they'll trust that somehow you'll reciprocate and you'll give it back. Now, this isn't always the case. There are plenty of people in all areas of human activity that aren't trustworthy. But by and large, we're talking about the overall thrust of a community. Experiment and iterate together, which is this idea that you don't control and predict what you're going to do in advance. You start testing it out, right? You don't know if it's going to work. Every single startup company never becomes what you think it's going to be, right? The business plan changes, the people change, everything changes. And this model of adaptation has actually been key to the process of creation in places like the Valley. And it's also been key to biological systems, right? Alex Dagan was talking last night about the nature of biological systems. It was the recombination, the constant variance that caused productivity in biological systems. This idea of seeking fairness and not advantage. This is very profound because in the film last night, there was this instance where Arthur Rock was talking about creating Intel with Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce. And they just said, well, how much of the company do you want to give up? And they said, well, how about half? And they said, okay, right? And you don't see that conversation happen in almost any other form of economic activity, right? It becomes this constant negotiation, a battle between investors and startup companies. And this idea that, sure, why not half? Is very, very interesting. And it's this idea that, well, we're all in this together, and we all need to kind of share some kind of fair stake in this enterprise we're putting together. And this idea of error, fail, and persistence, that is, making mistakes is okay, failing is okay. And this is very hard in many parts of the world, because failure can basically ruin your career, your livelihood, your family reputation for a generation. And pay it forward, this idea that you give it back into the system. One of the things you'll find in the startup business is that everyone's willing to help you. It's very, very surprising to people who aren't from this community, but you can get advice and help from almost anybody if you approach them in the right way and you're asking the right questions. If you just have to send a really interesting email, and you can probably get a response from almost anyone that you can think of in these types of communities. So then the question goes to, how do humans change behavior, of course? And this is a very difficult question. If you look at the work of psychologists over the years, one of the things that has actually shown to change human behavior has been this process of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, what they find is people change behavior by doing, by actively testing out behaviors against the real world. And that by being aware of the response you're getting from the behaviors you do, then you actually adjust. And the reason CBT has been so powerful is because it actually works, and it reflects the way we learn in real life. We learn in real life when we just do stuff, and you see for yourself what actually works and what's productive. So the only way to build these systems then has to be real doing. And so if you look at, we created a set of tools, and these tools all reflect this idea of doing, active practice, being aware of what's happening in the system. So you learn by doing. There's no passive learning in building innovation ecosystems. We're creating systems where people are actively building a company, they're inventing a product, they're commercializing an idea. You enhance diversity. So the greatest power in these systems is to lower these walls that divide human beings. And so diversity means that people more distant from you are those people that you inherently are less likely to trust, but those people are whom you can create the most interesting opportunities, right? The people that, a scientist and a business person. Some of you have actually tried to put together a scientist and a business person together because you see that there's an opportunity. And what happens? 99.9% of the time, they can't stand each other, they don't understand each other, they hate each other, and usually nothing comes out of that effort, right? So there's inherent bottlenecks in getting very, very diverse people to interact and collaborate. But you have to have that happen. You have to get them in front of each other, and you have to find ways for them to overcome these barriers. The way people learn is by emulating role models and through peer interaction. So one of the things that happens, and this is something that psychologists have proven, right? It's our ability to mirror the behavior of others. And so you find, for instance, in the Middle East, right, the example of Maktub, the company that was acquired by Yahoo, has been transformative because suddenly all these entrepreneurs think, wow, a generation ago that would have been nuts, but not that long ago you saw this actually happen. People can actually build companies and make them very successful. Then build tribes of trust, so building communities. And this is one thing we've tried to do here at this conference, is to say, look, there are ways to do this. There are actually tools you can use to create communities where people actually start to trust one another. And this is something we've learned from a lot of the people in design thinking who've actually talked about the nature of setting up human interaction, setting the stage to foster the kinds of interaction that are highly desirable. The other thing is creating social feedback loops. This is something Elinor Ostrom talked about, which is people need to be able to know who's behaving by the rules and who's not. And when you have social feedback loops, which is these systems that allow people to communicate whether they're following the rules or not, or who's doing good and who's not doing good, that it's like a karma account, right? People know who's paying back into the system, who's obeying the system, who's following the system. And these communities, if you looked at the movie last night, you saw these venture capitalists. They all had to work together all the time, right? It was a fraternal group. And so that nature of these highly, highly tight social networks means it's not that the networks are tight that matters necessarily, so much as the fact that if you misbehave, people know about it immediately. And then making these social contracts explicit. That is, not just making them kind of silent, but when you start to say, look, this is the social contract, this is what we're supposed to do, it's easier for people to follow. That's just inherent in human nature. So what does it mean? When you boil it down and you actually look at how do we behave, we'll contrast the old world with the new world. So the old world was factors of production, land, labor, capital, and maybe technology. In this new system, and this thinking about innovation ecosystems, it's about cultural transformation. It's about changing human behavior fundamentally in these types of innovation groups. Instead of thinking of clusters, technoparks, and incubators, we start thinking about human connectivity, not just physical proximity. Physical proximity in a different era was basically a substitute for human connectivity. But we don't have to think that way anymore. We are fortunate enough where we're living in a time where human connectivity can actually cross geographical boundaries. So how do we build these bonds that connect very, very disparate parts of the human ecosystem together? Whereas in the old world, we thought of local first and then global. In the local communities, in the old world of thinking of startups, and you still see this happen a lot in economic development, is they'll tell startup companies, well, start locally, prove it, build your company with some local advisors, start with some local testing, start with local customers, and then if it really works, then you can go global, right? But this doesn't really work anymore. It's really about wherever the value chain goes, wherever you need to go to bring together the best advisors, the best investors, the best customers, the best suppliers in the world, do it. Instead of venture capital as being merely the process of writing small checks, it's about the fund managers and the human qualities that they possess, because human qualities actually matter in this. A fund manager is not just a fund manager. They become a stakeholder. They become a partner in the process of enterprise building. Instead of hiring by just skills and resume, which is what you see a lot. You see this happen in government programs for economic development all over the world, which is they look for skill bases. But they don't think about the people themselves and who are they? Character, trust, respect. Are they role models? Right? This stuff matters because the cost, the difficulty of doing innovative activity is usually what eats up the process. So if you've got people that actually become part of the problem, then it kills the opportunity. You need people that actually foster the growth of these entire communities. They change the way these systems and communities behave. Instead of planning for specific outcomes, you experiment, adapt, and iterate. And instead of measuring raw output, which is the way we've looked at these systems for so long, you start to measure the environment itself, right? Sometimes what you're trying to measure is not always easily measured by looking directly at it. Sometimes you look to the side. And so if you look at these environments, you actually realize the output flows from these environments. When you look at output, it's like trying to look at the flowers in a field instead of measuring the quality of the earth underneath, right? And when you look at the quality of the earth, the quality of the soil, and the environment around it, you realize it doesn't matter if the flowers happen to be in season. It just matters if the environment is capable of sustaining flowers over time. And this is a very, very different way of looking at innovation. And it's something to which we don't have all the answers, right? We know that the environments matter. How to actually measure them is something that we need to figure out. So rainforests thrive ultimately by nurturing what makes us uniquely human, right? Which is very, very different than the old economic models of the past. The old economic models were about overcoming what we thought were the bad aspects of human nature, right? Our randomness, our unpredictability. But innovation itself actually relies on that and thrives on it. So it relies us to do things that make us laugh, that make us happy, that make us cry, and that make us love. Innovation itself really relies, and it relies on what makes us happy to be alive. Because if you're not having fun, if you're not doing something that you enjoy, it's frankly not worth it. Innovative activity is just too hard. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Next, I'm going to introduce